welcome, and good morning to all of you who have joined us. Thank you for joining. Um, I also apologize for you having to go through such a long and lengthy introduction for me. This is the problem when you get older. You wind up having to take up more people's time summarizing what you've done in your career. So, okay, folks, I'm going to try and do the impossible for me, which is to share my screen and talk at the same time. So let's see if that's successful first. Teri, by the way, I would definitely have my hand up for a copy of your white paper. I think it's sounds like a fascinating project. Now, I've just pulled up my screen share, and hopefully you can see my introductory slide. Can somebody please let me know? You can. Yeah. Okay, so now I've clicked that into presentation mode, and hopefully you can see that okay as well. And can you see the chat box if I have it open?
Yes, I can.
You can. Okay, so I'll minimize the chat box as well, which means that I can't see the chat, but I'm very happy to also take questions as we go along. So if something is bugging you about what I've said, or you want to have some input midstream, I believe that Teri will be monitoring the chats as well. And Teri, feel free to just jump in and interrupt me. Okay. The circular economy. Well, I've worked in this field for, I guess, about 15 years or so. And what's interesting about the circular economy is, no matter who I talk to about this, certainly those that aren't working in the field, I'll say to them, I work in the circular economy, and they, put this kind of smile on their face and say, oh, do you? Great, yeah. And I'll say, well, do you know what it is? Oh, yeah, because intuitively, circular economy. So, we should know what it is. And interestingly, one of the biggest challenges that I face here in Australia, because the circular economy is relatively new, and it's, let's face it, it's relatively new in North America as well, is helping people to understand exactly what it is. So forgive me for rehashing some previous knowledge for some of you, but I think I'd like to start just by making it clear what the circular economy is, because there's a great deal of misunderstanding regarding these terms, and it's often seen as synonymous with recycling, which it is most certainly not. And I'm just about to show you why. To understand the circular economy, you just need to step back and look at the waste hierarchy. And remember, as kids, often in our classrooms, our teachers would stand up in their environmental science or environmental classes, and they talk about the 3 R's. And then the 3 R's became 4 R's and 5 R's. And this is the nature of growth-based economies, isn't it? We just constantly feel the need to add on. And so now we've got a waste hierarchy, essentially with 8 R's, but the main principles still remain the same. The question that I would have to you is, why do you think they have a hierarchy like this? What is this really all about? And the answer is that the waste hierarchy has been developed to begin to understand how you can extract the most value from a resource. It's all about resource productivity. So if we look at the top of the hierarchy, this is the most desirable thing to do, is refusing. So how does that fit into productivity? Well, if you've got, for example, a particular resource, and you've managed to find a way to deliver a similar good or service without using that resource, isn't that the best form of productivity? Similarly, for reduction, if you've got, 2 widgets and you can do the same job for 1 widget and you've managed to reduce, what you've essentially done is you've cut your costs in half, haven't you? So refuse and reduce are what I would often say, the golden goals of circular economy work. And they're often not talked in the circular economy, because after all, the circular economy is about, resources within the system. Nevertheless, it's still really important to highlight that one of our main goals in terms of national development and in terms of strategic corporate development is not to use resources in the first place. Moving down this hierarchy a bit, you've got a number of other terms, and I'm going to group most of these together, but reuse, repair, remanufacture all share similar characteristics. If you are reusing something, essentially the cost of reusing is really just the cost of maintaining it. I always say the cost of buffing up the product. And so reuse, the costs are quite low. And if you can reuse something, what you've really done there is you've doubled the productivity. Almost similar is repair and remanufacture, which go by the principles of if you can take a product that would otherwise be working fine and add a couple of wires or fix something within the component, what you've really done is you've extended the life of something at a very low resource cost. So that's what the waste hierarchy is all about. And that's why down at the bottom here, we see the words recycle, which are, everybody seems to love that word. Well, when you think about recycling, it is not an efficient way of handling resources, because what you've done is when you take, for example, a bottle and you crush it down to recycle it, well, what you've really done there is you've taken material that has been manufactured and manipulated. You are taking embedded labor and embedded costs associated with the production of that given bottle. And then you've gone through the trouble of adding additional transport and energy to crush it back down into a form where you can begin the cycle again. So at every step of the recycling process, you've got costs. Many of them wind up being hidden costs, such as the pollution that's associated with transportation. And so without avoiding these types of costs, we're never going to wind up using our resources efficiently. And that, folks, is what the circular economy is all about. So hopefully you can see now my screen on the integrated circular economy model. And this is my way of trying to represent what happens in a national circular economy. So on the left, you've got producers, and on the right, you've got consumers, the two main functions of resource usage in an economy. And so again, going back to the waste hierarchy, the initial goals that we're trying to do before anything else is to reduce and refuse at all steps of the way. So consumers should be trying to minimize the resources that they use. Producers should be doing similar, as should everybody else that's in the economic model. If we can do this, we are then left with a system of resources that are somehow cycling through. And so that's where the waste hierarchy begins to come in. If we can instill or initiate reuse and repair activities, what we're doing is we're upvaluing that resource. We're increasing its effectiveness. And as such, we are boosting the economy. And this, folks, is why the circular economy is a model that has caught the attention of many governments around the world, because they look at this model and what they see here is the ability to enhance productivity, the ability to reduce landfill costs, and the ability to weed yourself off of resources that often come overseas. And so as a result of this, the circular economy model is really a model of resilience. It's a model of making sure an economy is running at its optimal scale, but at the same time, it's a model that is highly resilient from external shocks, because internally you're managing your resources more effectively. And when you think about this from a business side, so that's the national circular economy case. That's why nations are interested in this. Why should businesses be interested in this? Well, obviously, on one side is the notion of building a circular economy that is dedicated at Kaizen, progressive improvement, reducing costs. And so all of these elements, you know, whether you're reusing, repairing, remanufacturing, these are all specific strategies that you invoke in order to try to reduce your corporate costs. And that's why the circular economy is important for business. So for example, if you've got a reuse strategy, and don't get me wrong, these are hardcore strategies that at times can be very complicated. For example, if you've got a reuse strategy here, what you're really trying to do with that strategy is somehow get your product back to your loading bay doors so that you can reuse it. And that brings in a whole new array of challenges involving transportation and connectivity with your customers and incentivizing customers to make sure that they take the products that they're using and maintain them so that when they send them back to your factory, they don't need extensive repairs. So these are all strategies that are invoked within the circular economy model. So I hope that's kind of clear, because it's really important for us to understand that the circular economy is not about recycling. It's about hardcore business strategies that are designed to maximize resource productivity. And in doing so, companies will profit. They will benefit from this. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, probably when we get to the Q&A section. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page, hopefully with the circular economy, I'd like to tell you an interesting story, if I may. And I'd like to tell you this story because this story is a story that talks about community and resilience. It talks about building a new way of living and collaborating together. And, you know, with the United States going through the issues that it's going through in terms of race and in terms of the polarized politics that you have, there will come a time when, you know, a degree of unification is absolutely necessary. And, you know, unification starts with small steps. And I believe that the circular economy and the requisite the requisite activities to create a circular economy are really the building blocks for that type of community. So let's begin the story. Cologne symbiosis is, as the name should imply, an activity that has occurred in a place called Cologne, and it's right there if you can see my mouse cursor. It's about an hour and a half drive from Copenhagen, and historically it's been it was an area of significance because Cologne is where the ferry sets off for Aarhus. Now, since then, they've actually created a bridge down in the south, which renders it, you know, less of less importance. But nevertheless, Cologne has strategically been quite an important midpoint in joining Zealand with Jutland in Denmark. Now, if you go to Cologne, you will see a picture very similar to this. Danish cities are just fantastic cities, and if you're touring the cities, you're eventually going to come across one of these fantastic churches. And so, indeed, if you go up this slope here and you're visiting this church, if you go up to the left here and walk up further up the hill, stop and turn to your left, what you'll see is this over the houses. You'll see their bay where the ferry comes in, and then you'll see across the way this plant. And what this plant is it's an energy plant. In fact, it's a coal-fired energy plant that's owned by a company called Dong Energy. Now, what's interesting about the origins of Dong is that, of course, when you're running a coal-fired power plant, one of the things that you need is water. You know, in order to drive the turbines, you've got to create steam. And the only way to create steam is by having fresh water. And one of the big problems with this in this part of Denmark is that they don't have a lot of potable water that's available. And so the closest source of water for this plant was about 20 kilometers away in a place called Lake Tisu. And the lake, I believe I even have a photo of that. The lake looks like this. And so Dong, as part of its agreement to set up its plant in Cologne, agreed with the municipality that they would jointly invest in a pipeline that would deliver fresh water from Lake Tisu down to the power plant. And it's really this story about Dong's initial investment in the pipeline and the focus that the general manager of the power plant had, therefore, on pipes, that kicks off a wonderful and interesting story around pipes in Cologne. So the story of pipes really starts, by understanding the lay of the land. So if you recall the picture of the church, and I'll just go up here, up in the top where it says 22, just above there, that's about where the church is. And so we were looking across this bay here, and we were seeing the Dong energy plant right here. And so if you see with the Dong Energy plant across the road from Dong Energy, there's a plant called a company called Statoil, which, as most of you will probably know, is one of the largest oil refineries in Scandinavia. So so we've got a coal-fired power plant and an oil factory, or an oil refinery. Now, the general managers of these two organizations happen to be Rotary Club members. And at one of the Rotary Club functions, they began to talk about their business. And of course, the Dong Energy general manager, whose plant's existence was so dependent on this water pipe, began to talk about their experience a little bit. And Statoil began to share their concerns. And Statoil, the general manager, said to the general manager of Dong Energy, my concern is this. We've got, in order to refine our oil, we need to have steam. We're not really in the steam business. We don't know how to do it properly. And so we've been having the worst problems with our steam generation systems. Now, the Dong Energy general manager looked at this person from Statoil and said, pipes. The person from Statoil said, I beg your pardon. The person said, look, what we could do, because if you noticed by looking at our plant, you'll see these large stacks. And what these stacks, they're emitting this white puffed gas, right? Well, that's not pollution. That's actually water. We're trying to get rid of steam. We're trying to siphon off the heat from steam. So that's just steam that you're seeing. We have too much of it. Why don't we build a pipe and we will send you the steam? Then you don't have to rely on these generators. And so they entered into a contractual relationship to share this steam. So here's the plant. And there's the pipe. So now we've got a couple of pipes running through Cologne. Another Rotary Club meeting comes along. At the next Rotary Club meeting, now there's a lot of talks about pipes, and Dong and Statoil are central to this discussion. Now, as they're talking about the wonders of their steam pipe, they're overheard by a person that runs this company up in the top right-hand corner called Novo Nordisk. Now, Novo Nordisk is an interesting company in that they, and this is something I didn't know until I had visited there, they make 80% of the world's insulin. Now, insulin is a yeast-based product, and in order to refine it into insulin, you need to have, you guessed it, steam. So as they were talking about this wonderful new project involving the delivery of steam through a pipe, Novo Nordisk got really excited about this and said, well, look, can we have a pipe too? So off goes another pipe. Here's Novo Nordisk. If you look at the plant, if you can see this treat area here, and if you looked really carefully, you would actually see the pipeline. And I believe, yeah, there's a picture of yet another pipe. So now we've got pipes happening everywhere. And we've got this Rotary Club that's now very active, and all they're talking about is pipes. And this poses a real problem for this person here, this Gyprock general manager. Now, the Gyprock general manager is really starting to become quite dissatisfied about this, because Gyprock, as you probably know, is it's known by many terms: wallboard, the chalkboard that they put up in houses, to create those walls that you can tap on. And inside, it's kind of that chalky white substance. Okay, so this is, of course, the problem, right? To make chalky white substance, you don't need a pipe. And so now this person is feeling really left out at the Rotary Club meetings. But, as he starts to talk about this, he says to the Dong Energy person, because he's been inspired by, this idea of sharing with your neighbors. And so he says, what are you doing with the the material that you have when you scrub out the sulfur dioxide from your coal-fired power generation process? They said, oh, it's a real hassle, because we've been having to pay to have it carted to throw away. He said, part of that substance is an artificial gypsum. Did you know that? And they said, yeah, of course. He said, in fact, it's exactly the same type of material as the natural gypsum that we have to purchase and transport from France to our plant. So how about if we come to an arrangement and we'll take it off your hands? So yet another contractual arrangement occurs. And I must admit, I took these photos, as you can see, in 2014. So I've forgotten. One of them is artificial gypsum and one of them is natural. I can't even remember which one's which anymore, but that's how close these two are. So the Cullenberg symbiosis, based on these types of discussions, has now really morphed into this incredible organic network. This was not seeded by anybody, really. It would just happened. And as it started to build, academics started to become aware of this and started to report on this. But it wasn't really until people saw this in its full glory that they realized that this is a perfect example of what we've been trying to talk about in terms of industrialized sharing of resources. And as you can see, here's Dong at the center of this, the municipalities. So here's the water that's coming in the 70s. Here's the relationship that Statoil, the oil factory, has with Dong Energy. Here's the relationship that Dong has with Gyprock. Novo Nordisk had an interesting project where they were manufacturing as a result of the the insulin manufacturing process. They had a lot of byproducts that is perfectly environmentally benign. Indeed, it was loaded with nutrient-rich ingredients from the yeast, and it of course is a wonderful slurry. And so what did they do? Well, as it says here in 89, they created yet another series of pipes and started to pipe this slurry out to the farms so that the farms could use this for fertilizer. And it became so popular that all the farms started to take this stuff on. And yet, as Novo Nordisk grew, they soon discovered that even after saturating all of the potential markets around Colomberg for this yeast slurry, they still had too much slurry. And so they sat down and started to think about, how do we now get this to other farms around Denmark? And that led to this idea of dewatering the process. So they would desiccate the substance and it would turn into a solid substance that was easily transportable. And that led to the creation of a new company that was called Novogrow. So that's another element of the circular economy, is that these discussions about, hey, what can we do with this resource, leads to discussions about, new products and new ideas, new services. And indeed, for me, that's the exciting part of this business that I work in, because I work extensively in design thinking, helping people to apply design thinking principles to the creation of new and exciting materials.
May I interject with a question?
Of course.
Thank you. This comes from our one of our transportation and supply chain experts.
Yep.
The circular economy is something discussed in the world of supply chain quite extensively. The first step has been to address the concept of total cost of ownership, which tries to capture the overall cost of goods movement by considering something beyond transport. Supply chains have looked at management of packaging and reverse logistics to control environmental impacts. So what might, you've just given us this brilliant example of something very live happening. What might be the market-based incentives that support the circular economies?
Yeah, so we face this, Teri, here in Australia as well. All new markets face this. The big problem with the circular economy, as you know, as I think you might start to gather as we talk through this, is that the circular economy is a really complex system. You should see some of this, the concept maps that we do for circular economy precincts here in Australia. They are just loaded with different players. I've just done one recently for a business precinct with 10,000 businesses. And in order to create this type of network, you need connections that are in the thousands. And so as a result of that, the ability to put all of this together is really difficult. And I guess, therefore, my main answer to you would be, first and foremost, it's really helpful to have a centralized center where people can come. Indeed, the Cologne symbiosis is a case in point. I'll quickly just nip up to that map again. If you can see here, there's a picture of the Cologne symbiosis here. That's their office. So what's happened is that these companies have all realized that the idea of sharing resources and talking about ways that they can either collaborate on new businesses, new products, new services is so valuable that they should create an office to afford people a place to come and talk about these issues. So that's one element of policy that I think is really important, is the provision of that. The second element that is really important is the provision of education. And that's why at KPMG, we've designed the Circular Advantage program, because it's an 18 module program. So it's pretty intense. It takes about 5 months to get through the program. And it's a weekly there are weekly exercises that we take people through to allow them to understand all of the components that are necessary in order to design effective strategy for the circular economy. You can't just build just throw out something that's recyclable and say, there, I found a use for it, it's my new business. I'll give you a really good, I'll give you an applied example of that. We've got a company in town called Reground. And Reground is a very interesting small business. What they've done is they've gone around to the local cafes and they've asked them for their coffee grounds. And, for any of us who do any gardening whatsoever, we all realize that it's a wonderful source of compost for us, right? And so that's what they've been doing, is they've been mixing in these coffee grounds with other organics and creating compost. And this is their business model. But the problem with that business model, of course, is that all she really needs to kill off her business is another competitor to start coming into these cafes saying, I'll give you $10, every 100 kilo for your, or whatever. The point is that her business model is utterly dependent on the goodwill of these cafes, and there's no value being added there. Now, in order to rectify that, what you would need is a strategy that thinks about how do we upvalue this resource. And so another example of that in action is a company called Rotterdam, which is a company in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And Radosvam actually has taken the same model. So they collect the coffee grounds from cafes, but then they bring them back to a central location and they grow mushrooms. And they grow mushrooms in the packs, and then they sell the packs at local markets and through supermarkets. So there's something that's really interesting, because that allows them the type of revenue streams that will allow them to be able to pay for this type of material should they need to do so in the future. And that's what I mean by strategy. And so you've got to have an education program for this. Now, in terms of subsidies themselves, flat out subsidies, I would argue that not a lot's really necessary. Uh, Education is more important at this stage, because we are dealing with so many low-hanging cherries. And I'll give you a wonderful example of that. I walked into one of our supermarket chains here in Australia. There's really only two that are, well, sorry, three that dominate the market. So this chain is the equivalent of a a Safeway or an Albertsons or something that's found in North America. And the day before I went in to have a meeting with the directors of the company, I took my team in to do a site survey, and I took some photos. One of the photos I took was a picture of a young lad, and we've all seen this before. The young kid is sitting in the seafood section. He works for the company, and he's got a hose full of hot water, and he's spraying it on ice. Now, this is the ice upon which often these places put their fish, right? And so what he was trying to do was, it was the end of the day, they had packed away all of the fish that needed to be refrigerated, and then he was just trying to get rid of the ice so he could clean off the metal bins and go home. So I went in to see them, and I took that photo, and I put the photo up, and I said, I lived in Japan for 15 years, and when you come and visit somebody, you bring them a present, omiyage. I said, so I'm bringing you a present. Here it is. It's worth $5 million. You're welcome. And they said, what? And I said, look, we've timed this kid. It took him 35 minutes to, melt this ice. And if you add to that the cost of the hot water that's going through the hose, plus the cost of the energy that went into making the ice itself, you multiply that by 365, multiply that by 810 stores, you've got yourself a $5 million problem. And we haven't even started to talk about what we could do with the ice yet. I said, but what's really amusing to me about this is that somewhere along the lines, you're going to have a supervisor in one of these shops who's going to walk by this young guy and tap him on the shoulder and say, good job, Joe. And this is the problem with the circular economy, is that companies, they think that they've got it all sorted. They think that they've optimized everything that they can. And in a way they have, because they've optimized everything that they can in the narrow way in which they view their businesses. But there are other ways to view the businesses. And what the circular economy really is, and I always use this term, it's really about identifying opportunities outside the scope of regular business consciousness. And that's why we use, design thinking lenses and other ways to spark thinking and to develop, new types of products. So that's what's needed, is that type of incentive. If you want to give somebody a market incentive, it should be an education incentive. Get people understanding how to fish. Don't throw them the fish, as they say. Now, I gave this talk today to you because, I just feel that this ties into the small is beautiful literature that was around in the 1970s. And, we've lost our path here. One of the reasons we've lost our path is because we bought into this failed economic model. The failing of our current neoclassical growth-based economic model is really based on this idea of comparative advantage. And I don't want to get too deep into economic theory, But comparative advantage is really a theory that basically says if one nation is creating one product, chances are that product they can create, they might be able to create better than another nation. So you may get a nation such as China that has a lower cost base, and the United States that has a higher cost base. Therefore, everything should be more expensive. But it's the ratio between the products that's different. So, for example, the United States is comparatively good at making automobiles. And it has a higher cost base, but it's comparatively better at doing so because their systems are designed to do this better. Whereas China, for example, has a comparative advantage in making plastic products. And the reason they have that comparative advantage is not so much the cost base, that gives them an absolute advantage. It's the ratio of what they can do better. So comparative advantage is just saying you do what you do best, and then you trade with each other. And by doing so, everybody benefits. But the problem with this idea of comparative advantage, and this is the term, by the way, that underpins free trade and globalization, is that it depends on two things, two assumptions. One, that resources are not mobile, and two, that people aren't mobile. Neither of those two assumptions are valid in this world. And so as a result of this, because of this failed set of assumptions, what we are seeing and what you're seeing in the United States is you're seeing all the jobs going overseas because capital's mobile, and so are people. And that is just leading to a hollowing out of society. And this hollowing out then creates amplified pressure on families. And as a result of that, it leads to added social strife. So is it any surprise, that we're in the situation that we're in? And the whole idea of the small is beautiful movement and circular economy is that these types of collaborations, if they take place, like as I showed you in Cologne, in a unitary whole amongst a community, you start to create goodwill. You start to create innovation within that community. How are we going to use this resource? How can we use that resource? The great thing about the circular economy is that it needs people of all types. It needs engineers. It needs people who are in transport. It needs people who are in farming. It needs people who, are blue collar workers. It needs people, it needs people to build the pipes. All of this is, achievable whilst delivering profits to a national economy. And this is, I think, the great allure of the circular economy. I'm done, by the way. So if you have any questions, you just have to unmute because
I have a series of questions, but I also know that you have a few more very dynamic slides, and I'm hoping that we're at about a quarter before we end.
Yeah.
So perhaps we can balance those two, which is why I waited to ask.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no worries. I just had one other slide, but I mean that it's
Okay.
just it was just one slide that was just amplifying the point that I was making, which is that when you create things, so this slide, Teri, is just
Okay.
a slide taken from Samsu, which is the world's first self-sufficient energy island. It's also in Denmark, and what's interesting about the island is that they started by creating wind turbines. And in order to gain community acceptance, they created a model of cooperative investment. And so rather than the big energy companies swooping in and creating these eyesores that people would grumble about, they created a community investment so that every time someone drove by a wind turbine, they'd look at it and think, that's my money at work, And what's interesting about the energy movement in Samsu is that because of the benefits that the community started to gain through this idea of sustainable development, they began to look closer at circular economy issues and how they utilize their resources on the island better. And this has led to a really wonderful, it's one of the best places that I've been. It's because it's just, the people are wonderful. And it's just people that are dedicated to, trying to live with the land, but with the understanding that, they don't want to be poor. They want to do well, but at the same time, there's a new model that can be had. And I introduced this slide just to say, a lot of these things, because people will be asking, well, how do we get this going? And I think the answer is you get this going by one step at a time. You get one thing going and people get excited about it. You get those people excited, then they're going to get two things going. And this is how you'll find exponential growth starting to occur.
So I do have thank you. And I do have a series of questions, and
Yep.
we'll see how many we can perhaps go through.
Sure. Sure.
One of those that kind of is obvious for right now is, have your thoughts changed regarding circular economy due to COVID-19, and what are the lessons learned?
No, well, actually, they've just been reinforced, to be honest. So two of the design thinking lenses that we use all the time in the circular economy, virtualization and sharing of resources. So think about this now. You've got a whole bunch of companies that are shut down, or some of them are only working at sort of half speed, but they're still paying for all of the plant and equipment that they have initiated. This is an opportunity for companies to attenuate some of their losses by starting market scans to look at who in the market could potentially be benefiting from use of our assets on a leasehold basis. So that's one element. And then the other one, which I frequently highlight, is if you make a list of companies that are doing really well in times of COVID and companies that are failing miserably, that list of companies that are failing miserably, I'd be willing to bet have really poor digital vending strategies. So they have poor websites. They're not set up for online marketplace, and as a result of that, they're suffering this is why the circular economy builds resilience.
Here's another question. In your recently published book, along with Marilyn Brown and Benjamin Sovacool, Empowering the Great Energy Transition Policy for a Low Carbon Future, you advocate for regulatory and policy change to avoid some of the horrendous effects of climate change. Yet in spite of the momentary lull in CO2 pollution due to rolling shelter-in-place requirements, cities and counties are straining and backtracking on recycling programs and regulatory oversight due to unanticipated COVID-19 related holes in their revenue streams. I'm based in California, and we are about half of the global group attending this webinar today. And we pride ourselves on leading the nation in environmental climate change initiatives, yet we too are failing. How do we fix this? Big question.
Yeah. Well, part of this can be fixed next November. But aside from that, I always say when I'm teaching students in public policy, I tell them that in this day and age, knowledge is something that is stronger when it is delivered by the masses. Because we're dealing with such complexity, no one individual has all the answers. And so I think it's really important. We use the term polycentric policy making, which means the poly just simply means numerous centers. Mm-hmm. And so the idea behind it is to have a number of varied initiatives, all people working from different angles at this. And, hopefully getting to a stage where, you can you know, begin to, as a whole, have an impact. And that way, when you have a massive failing, like you do in the United States at the federal level, you know, these polycentric, the other activities still succeed. And indeed, you know, that's largely, if you look at energy policy in the United States, it's very sad what's happening. But at the same time, there are some states that are really showing some leadership, and California is one of them. And, you know, so, you know, that's a really good example of how, you know, polycentric policy making can avoid some of the, you know, the dysfunctions of top down.
Thank you. Okay. Here's another question that came in from one of the other attendees. What are the most impactful top policy actions to advance circular economy in the US and globally?
For my team, we basically work on two elements. One is engagement with what we call councils, which are the municipalities. And at the council level, we work with councils rather than the federal government, for example, because the councils are the doers. They're the ones that, you know, are in touch with the business owners. They understand what their challenges are, and they're more able to identify, you know, who might and who might not be effectively enlisted as a, you know, an advocate of change. And so that's one thing that we try to do, is we try to work with councils to help to educate those that can be change champions. On the business side, it's a matter of getting in the door. As I said, I really, although policy is great and it's important for example, businesses, with the circular economy, you'll have a progression. The first progression will be the low-hanging cherries. Those low-hanging cherries really will cost almost nothing when it comes to investment, and the payback in terms of profits will be high. And that's where we're at right now. And so we don't need a lot of money in terms of R&D for that type of investment. That's not to say that we don't need R&D to take it to the next level, because the next level is when you identify a potential idea that requires the manipulation of a resource, you then need some R&D. Great case in point, a lot of companies that are in the service industry produce a lot of bread waste. Now, bread waste, you know, obviously you can crumble it up and you can throw it into compost and retain the nutrients. But to me, that's a pretty dumbed down solution. You know, what you could do with bread waste is you can extract the oil from it and you can reuse the oil. You can extract the proteins from it and use that for animal feed. You can extract the succinic acid from it and you can create, you know, a form of like a polyester type of thread that can be used for clothing and other materials. And you can extract the polylactic acid, which is an important input into the creation of hard plastics. And then you can put it in the compost. And so the process of doing that requires some research, and that's where the government really starts to need to make some investment. And unfortunately, you know, this is why I find that question to be so incredibly difficult to answer,
Yeah.
is that unfortunately, when you've got politicians who, you know, are, you know, they're the equivalent of junkies, you know, which is that they rely on the benevolence of powerful vested interests. And when they don't govern for the people, you wind up in a system where you just can't respond to that. And you're right, gutting the EPA is just, yeah. Even these people that are you know, spearheading the you know, the neutering of these effective environmental governance organizations, you know, when they go on vacations, where do they go? They go to environmentally nice places. So, you know.
I think last question before we begin to close up, but it kind of, it really works very well with what we've just been discussing. What role should circular economy play in decarbon strategies?
Well, that's the first, that is the first low-hanging cherry that I look at when I go into companies, energy efficiency strategies. Go into your I mean, look, I haven't lived in North America for over 30 years, so, but you know, go into your, I suspect it hasn't changed much. Go into your local supermarket and have a look at your refrigeration units in there. If it's anything like it still is in Australia, you've got these refrigeration units that have no doors on them, and you know, they're just blasting out this cold air. And you know, come on, none of us would do this at home. Could you imagine if your child left their refrigerator door open and wanted to do something else? There'd be screaming and yelling in the house for the rest of the day, wouldn't there? And yet, you know, that seems to be perfectly acceptable in corporate practice. But what amazes me about that is just how stupid it is, because you're just wasting so much money. And anybody that's willing to waste that much money doesn't deserve to be employed as a strategist in an organization, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Wow. Scott, this has just gone so quickly, and we're coming closely to the end of our hour. I want to thank you for generously sharing your time and expertise to address these critical and timely issues of circular economy, restoring economies and communities, as well as answering some of our questions. Scott has let me know that if any of you have further questions, you can check out his website, which is a really generous resource on the circular economy, featuring links to case studies and Scott's books. And if you've not noted his email address, just reach out to me and I'll be happy to share that with you. He's also will allow me to publish his slides on my website, which I'll do. A recording of this webinar will be posted on my website as well. LINKCO Executive Search provides elite companies with top CXOs and upper management nationwide using a proprietary step-by-step process for both clients and candidates. We are on 24/7, 365. When you need help, please call upon us. The next webinar is on July 22nd at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, entitled Environmental Technology Startup in a COVID-19 World, Lessons from the Trenches. And this is with Rick Bacon, CEO of Aqua Metrology Systems, and will shortly be posted on my website if you want to sign up. Please reserve your seat and stay tuned for additional topics and speakers. And do let me know what topics would be of use to your business sector. Thank you very much. Great. Have a good morning, Thanks, good afternoon, and a good evening, and stay safe. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Teri. Thanks all.
Thank you.
All the best.
Bye-bye.